Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 2. That is the Bio 112 sequence. We are talking about the digestive system this time around. We're going to divide this digestive system into 4 sections, and we're going to begin today with Section A of the digestive system. So let's keep in mind a main idea for this digestive system. And the big idea here is that we're going to be taking in food and breaking it down into subunits, breaking it down into building blocks. And these building blocks are going to be things like nutrients and minerals and vitamins. And we need to absorb them. And then when we're done taking the good stuff away from the food, there are some unusable items, and those things need to be gotten rid of. So let's go ahead and start our discussion with some overviews and then go into some anatomy of the system. So as we see from this image, this is an overview of the digestive system. We can start in a superior direction with the mouth, also called the oral cavity. It would then lead to the pharynx. And from the pharynx, this digestive system goes down to our esophagus. And then from the esophagus, we arrive at the stomach, and this is where we're going to chemically and mechanically digest our food. And then from there, it changes names. Once we add some chemicals from the pancreas, we call it this food is called chyme. And from there, it moves on into the small intestines, and we can see the long, sinuous journey of the small intestines in this image. And then from the small intestines, we go to the large intestines, and the material is then eliminated. Along the way, we see accessory structures that help out the digestive system. Teeth are going to help us with mastication, and so is the tongue. Salivary glands are going to lubricate and add chemicals for digestion. The liver is going to secrete its own chemicals to assist, as well as the gallbladder. And then lastly, the pancreas also is going to secrete a sort of magic cocktail of enzymes and salts that are going to help break down that food stuff into the essential building blocks that the human body needs. So we see on this diagram an overview, a little bit more in detail. We're talking about functions of the digestive system. So the terms that are highlighted in the bold colors are going to be processes that are occurring in this digestive system. So we start with ingestion, where the food is coming into that oral cavity. We're doing more than just tasting our food at this point. We are chewing it up, masticating, in other words. And this is going to begin the process of mechanical digestion, chewing. From there, we get some propulsion, swallowing, and also peristalsis moving through the esophagus. We'll take that food and send it to the stomach. And then at the stomach, we have chemical and mechanical digestion occurring. That means we are flipping the food up and down with the muscles that are in there. And we are also adding chemicals to that food as well. A big misconception is that the stomach is in charge of absorption of nutrients, and that is not the case. As we'll see soon, the small intestines have that job of absorption of nutrients. The only things that can really absorb into the stomach are water and alcohol, and possibly aspirin. Okay, from the stomach, the contents then move into the small intestine. Here we have chemical and mechanical digestion, and this is the main site of absorption. As we can see from these arrows, this is where building blocks are moving into the bloodstream. Things like amino acids, things like glucose are coming into our bloodstream. Also recall from the lymphatic system, we have some immune system and lymphatic functions that occur along with this digestive system, showing that some of the materials are absorbed in lymph vessels. From the small intestines, the material goes into the large intestines, and we are pretty much done with absorption of nutrients at this point. However, we are still absorbing some substances, such as electrolytes and vitamins B and K. We are, in a sense, sort of quote-unquote drying out the feces, and we are preparing them for export. And that undigestible matter is stored in the rectum, and there are muscles in the anus that release the contents of this rectum, and that process is called defecation, aka elimination. So in summary, the GI tract is also called the alimentary canal, and there are many processes that move it from start to finish in this alimentary canal journey. Here are some good definitions that might be helpful, talking about some of the processes we just discussed. At this point in our discussion of the digestive system, we're going to talk a little bit about membranes of this digestive system. So in the upper left, as a review, we see that the human body has two main cavities, the dorsal and the ventral cavity. Here we're focusing specifically on this abdominopelvic cavity, and that's going to be in the larger ventral body cavity. So inside this cavity, we have various membranes. And so we're going to be looking at some serous membranes of the abdominal cavity. The first one that we're going to see is this item called the parietal peritoneum. This is the serous membrane that lines the inside surface of the body wall of the abdominal cavity. Next to this parietal peritoneum, we see a visceral peritoneum. This is also a serous membrane, and that's going to line the surface of the internal organs of the abdominal cavity. And we then create what's called a peritoneal cavity. And so this peritoneal cavity is going to be located between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. Here on this diagram, we get a cutaway showing some greater omentum, some mesentery, and some mesocolon. This term mesentery refers to a double layer of peritoneum, and this is going to support, suspend, and stabilize the GI tract organs, the alimentary canal organs. Then this item called the greater omentum is going to extend inferiorly from the inferolateral surface of the stomach. And then we also have a lesser omentum. The lesser omentum is going to connect the superior medial surface of the stomach and the proximal end of the duodenum to the liver. And so this mesentery improper is going to be a sort of a fold of peritoneum that's going to suspend most of the small intestines from the internal surface of the posterior abdominal wall. And so here on this slide, we have a sagittal view of the human body, perhaps giving us a better view of those omentums and mesocolons. Let's talk about the mesocolon. That mesocolon is shown right about there. And this is a fold in the peritoneum, and that's going to attach parts of the large intestine to the internal surface of the posterior abdominal wall. We now turn our attention in the digestive system to the GI tract, the layers of the tract, the gastrointestinal tract wall, so to speak. So this GI tract is a hollow tube, and in bolded letters, we can see that it consists of four main tunics: the mucosal layer, the submucosal layer, the muscularis external layer, and the serosa layer. Let's go more in depth into each one of these layers. We'll start from the inside with the lumen. We see this lumen gets its name for the word light, so to speak, because it's empty and clear. But of course, this is typically going to be filled with items like food or chyme or feces. Next to this lumen, we see the first main layer, the mucosa. And this mucosa is first lined with epithelium. And then this epithelia needs a basement membrane to attach to. So we have lamina propria to make that happen. Moving in a more superficial direction, we now arrive at a thin layer of muscle. That's going to be our muscularis mucosa. And now we arrive at a second main layer of the GI tract, and that is the submucosa. In this submucosa layer, we can observe the presence of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. In addition, we have glands. And keep in mind that this GI tract diagram is very general. What's going to happen is, as we discuss more about organs like the esophagus and small intestines, we see specialized structures. So, for example, these glands shown in the submucosa will change names and functions as we move through the tract. Then we move to our third layer of the GI tract. That's going to be the muscularis externa. And in this layer, we see two layers of smooth muscle. The first layer is going to be the longitudinal muscle, and the second layer of this external tunic is going to be a circular muscle. If you make an observation on the diagram, perhaps you can see the circular fascicles of this circular layer, and perhaps you can see the longitudinal fascicles of the longitudinal layer. Lastly, on the outside of this GI tract, we see our fourth main layer, the serosa. This serosa is going to consist of epithelium and connective tissue. So in summary, these organs all work, these tiny organs within the larger organ all work together to perform functions of digestion. Specifically later on, we'll see how these muscles in the GI tract contract and move for things like peristalsis. So peristalsis is a wave-like motion moving through this alimentary canal. Well, now we are ready to begin a journey through this alimentary canal, and we start at the beginning with the mouth, the oral cavity. Here in this mouth, we have a variety of features. So this oral cavity is the entrance to the GI tract, and here the food undergoes mechanical and chemical digestion in this oral cavity. Let's take a look at some of the features and anatomical structures of the mouth. We see that the vestibule of the oral cavity is a space between the gums, lips, and cheeks. And then this oral cavity proper is going to be bounded laterally by the cheeks, anteriorly by the teeth, and lips as well. And then it's going to lead posteriorly to the oropharynx. We also have buccinator muscles that are going to keep food between the upper and lower teeth. And these cheeks are going to terminate at the fleshy lips. And these lips are, remember, formed by a muscle called orbicularis oris. On the superior region of this oral cavity, we're going to see two palates. A hard palate forms the superior and anterior boundary of the oral cavity, and then a soft palate tends to be more posterior. When you look in the mirror and open your mouth and say ah, so to speak, you see a little item dangling down in the back. That's called the uvula, and that's a sort of cone-shaped projection in the median area of the soft palate. And then this tongue is going to be making the floor of the oral cavity. We see that the tongue is primarily consisting of skeletal muscle. In addition, we're going to see the presence of tonsils in this oral cavity, and we're going to later on we'll see that we have salivary glands in this region as well. In this diagram, we see a frontal view of the mouth. We have a couple skeletal muscles that are going to help us with mastication. The palatoglossal muscle and the palatopharyngeal muscle is going to assist us in mastication. Here's a closer look at the tongue. In addition to it being mostly muscle, and by the way, that muscle is going to be attached to a bone called the hyoid bone. You might recall that's a free-floating bone. Also, the mandible, hard palate, is going to be providing support for this tongue as well. And then on the surface of this tongue, we see papilla. These are the bumps that we see. Then within those papilla are taste buds, and those taste buds are where we get sensory input going to the brain for sensory integration. In addition, we see other papilla on the tongue, the fungiform and filiform papilla as well. Let's take a closer look now at salivary glands. These are going to be glands that release saliva into this oral cavity. Here we talk about four main salivary glands. There are intrinsic ones, but here we're focusing on the parotid salivary glands. Notice that that's right next to masseter muscle. And this is going to be the largest of our salivary glands and is going to secrete about 25 to 30% of the saliva. And this is going to be moving through parotid ducts into the oral cavity. The next gland we see is a submandibular salivary gland. Notice how it gets its name because it is below the mandible bone. And this is going to secrete about 60 to 70% of the saliva into the oral cavity. And we also have sublingual salivary glands. These are going to extend multiple tiny sublingual ducts that open into the oral cavity. These are going to produce about only 3 to 5% of saliva. Saliva, it's interesting to think about how much we produce. That's going to be about 1 to 1.5 liters of saliva produced daily. The saliva consists mostly of water, about 99.5% water, but we also have some important solutes suspended in this water. One's going to include salivary amylase, lingual lipase, mucin, and also lysozyme and immunoglobulin A. There's a function to having salivary glands. The saliva is going to moisten the food. It's also going to initiate chemical breakdown of the starches. It's going to dissolve food molecules. It's going to cleanse oral cavity structures and also inhibit bacterial growth in the oral cavity. Here we look at a homeostatic imbalance of the salivary gland. We see that there's a condition called mumps. Mumps is an inflammation and enlargement of the parotid gland. Students who would like to read more about this can find information on page 1028 of the McKinley textbook. And as you know, we have vaccines that are very common nowadays that prevent us from getting this homeostatic imbalance. Here we turn our attention now to an accessory to mastication, a accessory to mechanical digestion, in other words, and that are the teeth. On a basic level, we see on the left that a tooth consists of a crown, a neck, the roots, and then in the inside we have pulp cavity. Coming back to this crown region, we see that there's a substance called enamel, and enamel is unique that it is the hardest substance in the human body. It consists of calcium phosphates. And then below that we see a substance called dentin. This is going to be calcified connective tissue. And then we're going to see this substance called cementum. That's going to be a periodontal ligament that's going to hold that tooth into place with the bone. On this diagram, we see that there are a variety of teeth in the oral cavity. We'll start anterior with these incisors. Notice these incisors are sort of quote-unquote chisel-like, and the purpose for these incisors are going to be to sort of nip off bark, or maybe nip off buds of recent growth, or strip off bark off of a tree. It's good to think about of the animals that have large incisors. These tend to be herbivores. Another tooth we see is the canine tooth. It has a more pointed shape to it. Its function is to tear or pierce flesh. And then whether we are herbivores, nipping off buds, or carnivores, ripping off flesh, either way we send that material back to the premolars and molars. This is going to grind it up into a fine paste. Keep in mind we do want to chew our food very thoroughly. If we can make this into a nice fine paste, the process is much easier on the digestive system overall. In addition, on the left side we see deciduous teeth, also called milk teeth. These deciduous teeth get their name for leaves that fall in the fall. Deciduous leaves come from deciduous trees. They fall out every so often. Well, so do these deciduous milk teeth. This diagram shows a couple ages where we gain and lose them. And now we come back into our GI tract. We're looking at a organ called the pharynx. So this is going to be posterior to that oral cavity. This is a funnel-shaped tube, and we can divide it into three main regions. The nasopharynx is going to be more superior. Our oropharynx is going to be more so by the oral cavity, and laryngopharynx is closer to a respiratory region called the larynx. Notice we have a skeletal muscle in this region that's going to be lined by a mucous membrane. So let's keep in mind that this pharynx is a passageway for both food and air to travel through. We now turn our attention to the esophagus. We see on the upper left is a histology image showing a transverse view of this esophagus. Notice that we have those 4 layers of the alimentary canal present in this histology image. The function of this esophagus is to secrete mucus and transport food to the stomach. So this esophagus is really an organ that is composed of both skeletal and smooth muscle, and we have some epithelia, nice thick epithelia on the inside that's going to be thoroughly coated with mucus. There's a voluntary phase to swallowing, and then there is a involuntary phase to swallowing. Either way, we're going to bring this food down to the stomach, where it's going to undergo a mechanical and chemical digestion. So after swallowing in the pharynx, we get a presence of a substance called a bolus. So a bolus is going to be food mixed with this new saliva. And the presence of this bolus in the lumen of the esophagus stimulates peristaltic waves of muscular contraction, and that's going to propel the bolus towards the stomach. This esophagus has superior and inferior esophageal sphincters, and those are going to relax during swallowing. And that brings us to a homeostatic imbalance. What happens when those sphincters fail to work properly? And we might get gastroesophageal reflux disease. And we might get a situation where acidic chyme, a substance called chyme, sort of refluxes into the esophagus, and that's going to cause burning pain and irritation. That's because this substance is quite acidic to this tissue. We can prevent ourselves from this homeostatic imbalance by avoiding items like coffee, chocolate, tomatoes, onions, and mint. Or we can also, GERD may be treated with proton pump inhibitors, histamine blockers, and antacids. So now we arrive at the stomach, and let's go through and look at some general gross anatomy of the stomach. We see a region called the cardia of the stomach and the fundus. We move into this body of the stomach, which has a greater curvature and then also has a lesser curvature. and we have a sphincter, a pyloric sphincter at the end of it. And that's going to be approaching the duodenum. Notice the stomach has one special feature, and that is it's the presence of an oblique layer of the muscularis externa layer. So therefore this, again, remembering that this is an alimentary canal organ, so it's going to have those 4 basic layers. Here we're focusing on that muscularis externa layer. These 3 muscle layers are going to be able to move and churn and flip and flop that food until it gets mechanically digested. We also see the presence of these folds on the inside of the stomach. Those are going to be called rugae, and that's in the mucosa layer. So this stomach has a function, and it serves to mix and hold the food. That's going to begin the digestion of protein, and we're also going to continue the digestion of triglycerides. Here, it changes this substance that was once called food is called bolus, and here it is now going to be called chyme because we're mixing in new substances to it. So in summary, the stomach is an organ that holds food and then chemically and mechanically digests it. Now keep in mind that the stomach is not going to be absorbing nutrients. We're strictly absorbing just a couple items. Still, we're in the process of getting the food ready for absorption coming up soon. Let's look now closer at the mucosa layer of the stomach. So this mucosa layer is going to be consisting of simple columnar epithelial cells. And these epithelial cells are going to extend down into the lamina propria, the basement membrane, that is. And that creates what we call gastric pits and gastric glands. And we're going to have 3 types of exocrine glands. We have mucus neck cells that secrete mucus. We have chief cells that secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase, and parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. We pay particular attention to these chief cells and parietal cells in our lab class, where we see how it requires pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid to react together to create a substance called pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is what's going to actually break down it's going to break down proteins in the stomach. Here we get a closer look at those specialized cells that line the mucosa layer of the stomach. The mucus cells are going to line the stomach lumen, and they're going to produce a mucus that is alkaline. And that's also going to prevent ulcers. That's because this stomach is very acidic. It's a high acidity environment. We have mucus neck cells located deep to the base of the gastric pit, and those are going to produce an acidic mucus. As we said earlier, those parietal cells are responsible for the intrinsic factor and the hydrochloric acid they release into the lumen of the stomach. This intrinsic factor, by the way, is going to be required for the absorption of vitamin B12. The hydrochloric acid has a dual purpose. It's going to facilitate chemical digestion, as we mentioned earlier, and it also kills many organisms that enter the stomach. We also have enteroendocrine cells that are going to secrete several hormones in this region as well. Let's talk about one of the special hormones. We should give credit to gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone that stimulates stomach secretions and motility. So this gastrin is a substance that's going to initiate the mechanical digestion and mixing of the bolus turning into a chyme. So in summary, the stomach is an organ of the GI tract that's going to hold the food, but also chemically and mechanically digest the contents. We now take a break off of the alimentary canal, and we just sort of summarize the digestive process so far. So what kind of process has occurred from mouth to stomach? So let's review those steps. Step one we encounter is a process called ingestion. And when we ingest, we have a process called mechanical digestion that involves mastication, aka chewing. And that's going to break that food down into multiple pieces. When we mix the saliva with it, we now call this substance a bolus. Because it has a different name, it has chemicals added to it. Let's look at some of those chemicals. Salivary amylase is going to begin starch digestion. It has a rather neutral pH. This bolus and enzyme become acidic. The 2.5 acidic gastric juices, the hydrolysis ends. We also have a substance called lingual lipase that's going to be secreted by glands in the tongue. And we begin the breakdown of triglycerides into building blocks, into those fatty acids and also smaller glycerols. So keep in mind that food has three main foodstuffs to it, so to speak. Food primarily consists of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So we need a way to break down each one of those three. Here, so far, we've talked about breaking down all three. Starches are similar to carbohydrates. Fats are considered triglycerides, and proteins we talked about getting broken down in the stomach. So we now move on to the next step of the digestive process. After mastication, the bolus is swallowed. We also call that deglutition. As mentioned before, we have a voluntary phase and an involuntary phase. And then after mastication and then after deglutition, that esophagus moves that food down to the stomach. So as we said earlier, it's a peristaltic movement of that food. So again, those circular and longitudinal muscles are working to move together to move that bolus down into the stomach. Well, that's about 4 to 8 second process and about 1 second for liquids. There's a lower sphincter, the gastroesophageal sphincter needs to relax to allow food to move into the stomach. And once we arrive at the stomach, we begin mechanical digestion. We have gentle mixing waves about every 15 to 20 seconds. Quite often we hear or even feel this gentle mixing when we have our stomach quote unquote rumble or tumble, so to speak, or growl, as some people say. These are going to be also having more vigorous waves that travel from the body of the stomach to the pyloric region. Now keep in mind this pyloric region is not completely closed. There's a little bit of an opening in there, so we're able to open that up a little bit and squirt out about 1 to 2 teaspoons with each wave. And then in addition to mechanical digestion in the stomach, we have chemical digestion. Hydrochloric acid is going to denature, that is, unfold those protein molecules. And as we said earlier, hydrochloric acid is going to transform pepsinogen into a substance called pepsin. And pepsin is going to be able to break down peptide bonds between certain amino acids. In other words, we're taking protein and breaking it down into individual building blocks. In addition, we're going to have fat digestion continuing. We have an enzyme called gastric lipase that's going to split triglycerides into milk fat. In addition, remember that this hydrochloric acid kills microbes, and then we also have mucus cells that are going to protect that stomach wall because we have a nice thick 1 to 3 millimeters layer of mucus in there. And there is a very, albeit small amount of absorption that occurs in the stomach because the stomach wall is mostly impermeable. However, a little bit of water can leak through that tissue. Some electrolytes can be absorbed. Certain drugs like aspirin can be absorbed, as well as alcohol. And then lastly, we see that we have a pyloric sphincter at the end of the stomach. So at this point, the stomach is getting ready to move its contents onto the small intestines, and that is where most of the nutrient absorption is going to take place. To do this, we need gastric emptying, and that's a result of peristalsis. So again, those complex muscles in the stomach are going to move to put that food into the small intestines. That's done because it's able to squeeze that food past that pyloric sphincter. And lastly, we see that if there are toxins present in the human body or irritants in that stomach, a natural reaction is to quote unquote vomit. That is a way that we rid the body of the contents of the stomach. So that is the summary of Section A, the first part of the digestive system. As always, for more in-depth information, feel free to consult our textbook. The next video will discuss Section B of the digestive system, and we'll be jumping into the small intestines.